Well, thank you, everyone. In this panel, we're going to investigate the racial homeownership gap. In 2020, there's still a persistent gap in homeownership rates between whites, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. And on one hand, you might expect there to be a lower homeownership rate among minority Americans. After all, we do have a history of discrimination in this country, which has left many with lower incomes as a legacy of that, as well as less intergenerational wealth to pass on for down payments and the like. On the other hand, 52 years ago this year, the Fair Housing Act was passed. 45 years ago, we had the Community Reinvestment Act. So you would expect that the homeownership rates in this country among racial groups would start to close, the gap would start to close, and that they would steadily rise. And we've seen that. I think many of us would expect that over time they would have risen more. And we did see them rise steadily for a period through the 90s, through the early part of this century. But dramatically, at least for African Americans, we started to see that homeownership rate decline. So much so that last year, we saw the homeownership rate for African Americans dip below the homeownership rate in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And then more dramatically, we've seen the gap between African Americans and white Americans widen. So here, we're going to investigate what this is all about. We're going to explore the dimensions of this problem, what are some of the contributing factors, and what are some of the solutions to help close the racial homeownership gap. We have a great panel. They've been introduced to you. We're going to start with Alanna McCargo from the Urban Institute, who's going to help us unpack this some and explore some of the dimensions of the racial homeownership gap.
Thank you, Bryan. And thank you to the National Association of Realtors for the invitation and for hosting this panel discussion. I think it's an important topic to continue to discuss in the current environment and as we look ahead. I'm going to just I'm going to set a little bit of background and foundation, building upon what Bryan just said, and then I think we're going to get into a good conversation that will hopefully bring a lot of the data that I'm going to share to light. A lot of this data, many of you have seen. I'm not sure where to point to make this. There we go. Have seen, but I'm just going to bring everybody to the same page in terms of where I'm coming from in my remarks and some of the comments you'll hear up here. As Bryan mentioned, the homeownership rate in America has been something that has been measured and looked at for a long time. And this particular slide just really shows you the breakdown by race. And we often talk about homeownership as a very national thing. The rate today is around a little under 63%, essentially, if you look at nationally everyone who's a homeowner in this country. And then you can see the breakdown by race here just shows you a little bit of a different picture. And I think it's important to just look at this picture and kind of look at it historically. This one goes back to 1960, but takes us forward to 2018, where you can sort of see steadiness, really, in terms of the homeownership rate across the board, with white homeownership being up, within the sort of 2% of 70% throughout history, up to 72.2% now. You can sort of see the nationals, that blue line, and then broken down by Asian, Hispanic, and Black population here. And what I'm just going to point out, and it's obvious, is when you look at this across time and up to the current period, you're seeing one line go in a direction that has been concerning and has been a topic of conversation, and that's the Black homeownership rate. And that, we obviously all went through the housing crisis leading up to 2008, and you can see since that time the recovery just is not present in the Black population, and that is one of the reasons why the Urban Institute has taken on a body of work to really study that and understand understand what is it that's preventing, we're seeing a lot of growth in the Hispanic homeownership rate. We know population growth has a lot to do with that. What is it that is getting, or underneath these numbers, to really help us understand this particular issue and really unpack it a little bit further in terms of what policy can be put in place to help address that issue. On this next, there we go. So Bryan also mentioned this, but we also have seen a major widening of the homeownership gap. And this, to me, it really mirrors what we talk about when we talk about the broader racial wealth gap. We know that the wealth gap overall between black and white is 10 times for Hispanic, 8 times wealth gap. And this homeownership gap sort of follows the same line as the wealth conversation. And that is because wealth for Black and Latino families is primarily made up of home ownership and home equity. And so that is a really important thing to keep in mind. And so the further and further away home ownership becomes for those populations economically, that wealth gap will continue to persist in the ways that we've seen. And today it stands at 30 points. So a couple just of other quick points I'll make before I turn it back over. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble knowing where to put this to make it. There we go. Because this is the Realtors, and this is an audience that is working across the nation, not just here in Washington, but really care about communities nationwide. We've done a lot of work to really unpack and look at things more locally. National is good; it gives you a good sense of things directionally, but you really do want to understand these trends in your local market. And we've done some work to essentially what we call mapping the home ownership gap. So we have mapping the Black home ownership gap. We've done mapping the Latino home ownership gap. We need to do mapping the Asian home ownership gap next. But we've, because gaps persist in all of those populations, what we found essentially is there is no city in America that has closed the Black-white home ownership gap when you look at cities by sort of by population size and concentration of population of our Black population. We looked at a number of MSAs, over hundreds of the top MSAs around the country, and this map just reflects sort of, you can see the Black homeownership gap is sort of the color, the darker the color, the bigger the gap, and then you can see that the size of the bubble really just tells you how many people or how many Black households are in that population. With the largest bubble representing 1 million. So you can see where the big gaps continue to persist. The largest gap that we've uncovered is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we've seen smaller gaps in places in Texas and smaller communities. Interestingly, a lot of communities that are near military bases, we find, have really done a interesting, it's interesting to look at that dynamic in those communities because there is some connection between large military bases, Black employment and income opportunity, and the home ownership rates in those same communities. So we've looked at that a little bit more and have released a couple of papers on veterans, military, and the home ownership rate. The other thing I will bring up is the Hispanic map, which just basically, and then I'll stop. I'm sorry about the delay, but I'm having. There we go. We took a look at the same data for the Hispanic population across markets, and I thought it was really interesting when you look at this, and this is a recent finding, is that 2 Texas cities in America actually have closed the Hispanic homeownership gap too. Both of them are in Texas, clearly, and then El Paso and Laredo are those 2 places. Looking at those are actually the 2 cities in America that have a very high population of Latino people and have actually eclipsed in the home ownership rate in those places. And that's, like I said, it's more of a recent phenomenon, but it's kind of interesting to look at. And we found that the Hispanic home ownership gap is largest in the Northeast and smallest in the Southwest. A lot of that has to do with the pricing of housing affordability in those markets, and then cities with larger Hispanic shares in their population tend to have smaller home ownership gaps overall. So,
Right.
just a little context there, and I think we'll come back to some of the other data as we get into the conversation.
Yeah. And Jim's the chairman emeritus of the Asian Real Estate Association of America. Can you speak to how the homeownership gap is manifest among Asian Americans in the country?
Of course. Thank you, Bryan. And again, thank you, National Association of Realtors, for bringing all of us together for this discussion and dialogue. It's an important one. Yeah, the Asian if you go way, you went back to 1960s. If you go all the way to 1900s, Asian homeownership rate was close to zero. Right, and because the Asian community weren't allowed to own properties and so on. Really, the Asian immigration pattern started in 1965 in earnest. Obviously, there were Asian Americans who've come as early as late 1600s, but primarily the Chinese who had come for the railroads, the Japanese to work in the fields, and Filipinos. But most of the population growth happened after 1965, after the Immigration Act. That's where you saw a spike in the immigration pattern. The Asian homeownership rate has steadily moved up. We did take a pretty, like everyone else, took a hit during the Great Recession, went down. It moved back up to, I think you had it at 59%, but I think it's a little, you might have given us extra couple points there, but.
It wasn't me.
I think but it's around that number. But it's short of 60%. It's like 58%. The challenge with the Asian community with the homeownership rate, and the gap between the Asian homeownership rate and the white community and the general population persists. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But the one thing that I always kind of throw out is this: if you look at the average income of an Asian American household, it's about $72,000, which is $20,000 higher than the general population. Right, and the credit score of an Asian American home buyer actually is comparable or sometimes slightly higher than even the white community, and generally the down payment that is provided by Asian American buyers tends to be higher than overall. And so if you look at those three factors, you would expect the home ownership gap to be flipped, but it's not. Right, and there's a number of different reasons to that, but that is that gap that we've been working on as an organization. When we started Asian Real Estate Association of America, 2003, the homeownership rate I think for the Asian community was around 53%. We would love to take credit for that, but obviously there's so many other factors that drive that number. But it's moving in the right direction. But there is that persistent gap that we have to figure out as a community.
Donnell, you want to share a little more of what you're seeing in terms of the black home ownership rate out there in the country? And Donnell's the head of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the president.
Thank you, Bryan. I am glad to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. The National Association of Real Estate Brokers was formed in 1947. It was out of a need for African Americans to serve the underserved community. We were not allowed to be realtors at that point. And we spread to about 100 chapters nationwide. We are the first fair housing association in the country. We've been fighting for that since 1947. Now, the concerning factor is that the black home ownership rate up until the second quarter of 2019 was 40.6%, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. We've come up and developed some solutions. We have declared war on this declining rate, and we've been penetrating all of the communities across America. We're pleased to announce it's not all the way back up, but we have in the last 2 quarters, we have seen an increase, an uptick. Third quarter 2019, it went up 2.1% to 43.7, and then this last fourth quarter, closing out 2019, we went up, and the black home ownership rate as of today, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, is at 44%. We have instituted educational series across the country because we believe that education is a big piece and down payment assistance and credit, but being educated on those will help increase black home ownership. It's an interesting study that shows that the average age, I believe Freddie Mac came out with this study, the average age of an African American purchasing a home is 48 years old. We're moving that dial with different programs that are coming out. More likely, HouseThenTheCar.com, an educational series that we're taking across the country. So that is where we are, Bryan.
So one interesting issue is just how the homeownership gap is manifest across the country in different communities. Alanna touched on that some at the opening, but you also have, like for example, among the Asian American population, many different ethnic groups. Do you want to speak, Jim, some to any variances, either geographically or among different groups? Because the Asian American population is not a monolith.
Thank you, Bryan. It's the community is as diverse as it gets, language-wise, just ethnicity. And if you look at the pattern, traditionally I think people think about the Asian American experience and say, okay, New York and LA, San Francisco. The fact is that the community is spreading, much like the Hispanic community, it's spreading to where the jobs are and moving around. If you look at just the Southeast, we saw in the last 10 years a 70% increase in population of the Asian American community in the Southeast, which you don't really typically would expect. In Texas, in the last 15 years, it was the fastest growing population in Texas, the Asian American community. If you look at Houston, it's the fourth largest Asian community in this country is in Houston today. So the community is spreading out in many, many different ways. The challenge with the Asian community is because the population is growing at a faster clip than any other population right now, immigration being a major driver of that, language becomes a big issue for the community. So what do we have, like 200 people in this room or maybe more? If every one of you were Asian American in this room, about 40 to 50 of you weren't here 10 years ago, right? You had not immigrated to this country. So it gives you a perspective of how massive that immigration pattern is and why language still is a big issue for the community. And the in-language outreach, being able to fulfill the real estate process in language, loan application in language, why that is so critical to growing that number even more. So, but anyway, that's one of the things that we look at, which is, and a lot of these communities like Houston, now they're much more mature in terms of fulfilling the needs of the Asian American home buyers. But 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't the case.
Right.
And some of these smaller communities aren't really set up to deal with this growth, similar to the Hispanic community.
Yeah. And can I just
speak to
add,
that? Yeah.
just because this dynamic of ethnicity and the differences are not just in Asian, this is also in the Hispanic community. You see this, you also see this in immigrants, black immigrants that are coming from other countries. This slide here, just as this is a net worth kind of wealth slide, it's just this looked at the Asian American population in Los Angeles, and just to see the differences here across ethnicity. We do a lot of this work, and I have to make the point that, we give these broad buckets, Asian, Latino, Black, but when you start to break things down in this way across the nation, you can see that there are variations depending on a number of different factors. Even within the Black community, even within the Hispanic community, you'll see, differences based on ethnicity, and a lot of that has to do with language. A lot of that has to do with a whole host of other factors, but there are different economics behind these different demographic groups that we need to keep in mind. They're not just one big bucket of things. Yeah. And these solutions in terms of solving the issues from a policy perspective might need to be different, and we need to think of those nuances as we're doing our work.
Yeah, Alanna, you're absolutely right, and that's quite stark. The wealth gap just within the Asian community. There's various different swings in our community, obviously. The Asian American, this is so surprising to a lot of folks, but the Asian American community today is hitting poverty level at a faster rate than any population. So people expect the Asian community overall to be doing great, but it is sort of a double barbell. There's people at the high extreme, and there are people at the low extreme that are not being recognized because everyone's looking at the average, right? And that's one of the things that we look at as well, making sure that everyone has access, not only at the high end, middle market, but folks at the bottom, which is growing for the community.
Donnell, you mentioned that the National Association of Real Estate Brokers was the first fair housing organization in the country. To what extent is discrimination still contributing to the lower black home ownership rate?
Well, it's rampant. It still exists. I find it amazing that the same lumber can leave the lumber yard, make a left on James Street, make a right on Martin Luther King Avenue, and then that same 3-bedroom house on either side of the street is devalued. According to a study by Freddie Mac, it's likely to be 30 to 40% lower as an appraised value. So discrimination is still there. Reality is preceded by a myth. I mean, the redlining, you can see it today that some of these major lending institutions have been fined 50 years later, 60 years later, fined for redlining and for discriminating. The loan level price adjustments, this is still going on today. So we've come up with some policy. Well, we want to endorse a few policies, a few bills, a few acts with Congress, and we're trying to push those things. The Beatty bill, Congressman Meeks and Sherrod Brown came out with a down payment savings, American Dream down payment savings plan that we're trying to endorse. We're also trying to invigorate home buying by adding African Americans to HUD Section 184. Those are the types of things, but discrimination is still present and still rampant. It's still a cry for, we still have to sound out the battle cry.
And Urban's looked a lot into this.
I want to add to that because so yes, discrimination. You mentioned redlining and some of the historical barriers. It is definitely still an issue in all practices that surround the real estate market. Whether it's the actual showing of homes. I think everybody in this room is familiar with what the study that came out in Long Island that showed and tested and showed results about the increased discrimination against people of color in that community. That's all real. It's certainly there, but there are other ways in which discrimination is showing its head, and I think that everybody we have now moved everything from manual to online, technological, digital, and the things that built those same systems have bias in them that are built now into those systems that need to be taken a look at. You mentioned appraisals, and I think that's a good thing to take a look at or use as an example of where you might see, because of historical redlining and discriminatory practices and valuations, that continues to persist, and you still see these gaps in valuations in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or Latino, and this is just a reality that I think we all still face, and we haven't solved. And I think companies and organizations and networks such as the Realtors are looking at these issues and really underlying problems there, looking at the results of these tests in communities, understanding that there's a problem there, and then really trying to figure out what are the exact things, what are the mechanisms for trying to tease out this. And one of the things I have to mention is we need to have strong fair housing enforcement. Affirmatively furthering fair housing matters. The plans that communities have put in place to ensure that they're enforcing fair housing matter greatly. And anything that is work towards minimizing or taking the teeth out of the ability to enforce and deal with these issues real time is harmful to communities. And I hope that we're we all just sort of think about that and focus on that as policy continues to transform.
Yeah, Alanna, I think you bring up a very good point. I think about this, the Newsday story, right, of the discrimination, unfortunately, that continues to persist in markets throughout the country. It's sort of a stark reminder of what that represents, right? And we struggle with, for realtor community, we struggle with supply issue, and trying to get people into homes and so on. So if you as a buyer is being shown 50% less supply, that has an impact on your ability to access home ownership, right? And and I think what that article pointed out was that African Americans certainly were discriminated the most. Hispanics followed quite a little bit below, and the Asian American community as well. Yeah. And I think the idea that we steer people or not show properties or show less properties, it really is, you can akin it to really sort of this, not giving people the full access to supply that is available in the market, and that's really a shame, and we need to do better by it going forward. And
this is also an issue, I just have to mention low-cost markets as well, right, because there is, in some of the work we've done on small loans, there's a lack of small lending, small dollar mortgage lending that happens. If a property is $50,000, some real estate firms won't show that. There are like sort of price points, and so it's important. Again, that's access. If you can't look at the supply, you have no opportunity to purchase the supply. Investors are in these markets. Very easy for them to use their automation and buy up these properties, and it really does potentially thwart homeownership opportunities for people of color in these communities.
It does, and the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, NAREB as it's called, will be issuing a statement at our conference next week that we are requesting, and we're looking into fair housing training yearly, because we find that bullying and other things are going on inside the offices, where we're being discriminated inside the offices.
And this is a priority for National Association of Realtors as well. I mean, we announced what we call our ACT plan to make sure that there's accountability, culture change among the real estate industry, and training on fair housing. Because if you don't see the properties you want to buy, you may not buy. And we don't want people buying things that aren't in the best interest of them and their families. So let's talk about solutions. What are all of your respective organizations doing to bring some solutions home? You want to start, Donnell?
Sure. NAREB is launching this tour because we believe that education is the first step. So we launched the tour, housethenthecar.com, because we know, I believe most of us in this room know, that when we go apply for our mortgages, that DTI, that debt to income ratio, could throw us out of whack, could throw us out of home ownership. We're taking that education into 22 local venues, local cities. And we're going to be putting on that tour in those cities. We've also developed a referral network using our civic engagement partners. We've also developed a way to help and or aid in helping people that can't get access to selling their home right away. We came up with bidnational.com. We came up with a few solutions that will be even more discussed at our conference next week in Las Vegas, but we're really pushing and pulling the trigger on education. Education as far as down payment assistance programs, as far as educating the credit piece and helping bolster your credit score. So that's the space we're going to be moving in over the next 2 years. This is an 8 to 10 year program, and because we're really pushing to get the home ownership rate up in the African American community up to 50%.
So at the Urban Institute, we're a research organization. So when it comes to thinking about solutions, one of our missions is to elevate the debate and really put in your hands and the hands of stakeholders that care about these issues as much data, evidence, locally useful information that can help you no matter what seat you sit in, whether it's you working with consumers on the ground in your neighborhood, you working with developers, you working with policymakers and regulators. I think it's so from our perspective, the work we've done over the last several years on this issue of racial homeownership gaps has led us to think about policy solutions in what we call a 5-point framework. And I'm going to just touch on that really quickly. One is that the solutions for the issues that we're talking about are not just federal solutions. State and local actors have a role to play. Local policy matters greatly in this domain. Particularly, you've heard a lot about, you heard even on the previous panel about kind of not in my backyard, like zoning, land use, all of those policies, restrictive covenants, deeds. There's a lot of things that are ingrained and entrenched at the very local level that the federal government can do all kinds of things and cannot solve that problem. So local action matters. And so we really are doing a lot of work to try to take our work from national to a lot more ingrained sort of local level understanding. And every locale, the solutions are going to be different based on what's happening in that particular area. But I think that's a really important piece that we really have been trying to eliminate and bring our work to a more local level of granularity to be helpful as a tool to everybody that's working out in those markets. Housing supply constraints and affordability, huge. And taking those on from a policy standpoint, I think is part of the solution. We've got to figure out the affordable housing supply and supply issues. Preservation falls into this bucket, and looking at the housing stock in this country that is, it's older than me and pretty much everybody on this stage. We've got an aging housing stock in America. It needs repair. People are aging in those houses. They need maintenance. So we've got to figure out solutions that take not only build new homes, but take issues of preservation, making improvements in homes and improving communities more of a priority and a focus, and we need to figure out how to do that affordably. Outreach and counseling, Donnell, you hit it. NAREB has really moved. We've been, really talking about, particularly with the work that we did with Freddie Mac on the mortgage-ready millennial population. There are 1.7 million Black millennials, 4.6 million Hispanic millennials that are ready to get a mortgage today, that they could afford, that they have the credit for, they have the incomes for. We looked at those top 31 cities and found these populations are there. And we've got to figure out how to reach them, first of all, because we know millennials are delaying home ownership for various reasons, and we also have to figure out how to get affordable supply in their hands. And then the other fourth point is just equitable and accessible housing finance system we need. I think things around housing finance reform, see our big policy conversations that are going on. These are deeply connected to access to credit for communities of color. We've got to keep that in mind as we do. We talk about the big GSE reform. We've been talking about it for a long time, and I know everybody in this room is exhausted by it. But we have to keep our focus on how changes in the housing finance system will trickle down and impact these communities, and anything that is sort of in the way of that, we need to be fighting for, frankly, in terms of policy change. And I think that's a really key area in terms of solutions. And then finally, sustainable homeownership. We've got a lot of people that are already homeowners. Part of that story, when I talked about the decline in the Black homeownership rate, a lot of that isn't that they never owned homes, it's that they owned homes and lost them. And so we have to remember the crisis. We have to remember that people need to get into homes that they can afford, that are in sustainable products, and that can build equity, because that's at the end of the day what it's all about, and everybody needs equal opportunities to be able to do that. So those are sort of the 5 points in the framework, and that applies whether it's Black homeownership, Asian or Latino. I think those apply broadly to all of those communities in different ways.
Yeah, yeah. I think you hit on all the key points there. We because we can't remember 5, we go with 3 points from our end. But I don't know. But going back to the sort of the fair housing discussion, as this country becomes more diverse, and communities are gonna, it's not a simple, hey, Houston is a great example. It's Hispanic, African American, Asian community make up almost equal number of the diverse community in that market. So one of the things that obviously this fair housing debate is not just a one-way street. We need, I think, as real estate professionals, we need to make sure that whether you're Asian, Hispanic, African American, white, whatever, that you know you serve people in the correct way. So we're doing a big campaign this year to create some education outreach to make sure we give everyone, no matter what your background is, full access to the opportunities that we fight for. The 3 points that we focus on, Alanna, you cover a couple of them, is GSE reform obviously is an important thing. Protect and defend a system that works fundamentally. We're focused on affordable housing, a duty to serve. For the Asian community, the conventional conforming market's a very important one. Asian community generally do not use FHA. I don't know if Bryan is in here or not, but unfortunately not yet. But the Asian community is the highest user of conventional conforming product of any minority group. And so for us, it is important to protect that. So that's one of the things that we're focused on. Language access, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very important topic for us. We thought we had a great step forward on that, but FHFA decided to pull it back in terms of their 1003 application that asked for information about language needs. Decided to make that a kind of an addendum, which probably is not going to, frankly, won't work, I don't think, in the market. So we're having that discussion again around language access. How do we get people the right information in language so that so they're not discriminated against, they don't get higher points and fees. And the last item is around credit scoring competition. The credit pattern of minority communities or immigrant community or young and older individuals are very different than your general population. And the credit scoring system that we have relied on to decide, serve as a gatekeeper for home ownership and mortgage finance, frankly, has been built some decades ago. And there's some innovative products that are out there. We want to make sure that FHFA, Fannie, Freddie Mac, continue to innovate in that regard, and I know there's some work around that, so we're continuing to push that effort. We're also focused on working with FHA to do exactly the same, to ensure that we look at new systems for opening the doors of homeownership opportunities for all families, minority families, and Asian community as well. So I think those are the things that we're looking at this coming year.
And NARB in the policy arena, we want to push those. HUD Section 184 is extremely important to us, which allows, I believe, Native Americans, Hawaiians, a 2% mortgage. We want to be able to include African Americans in on that conversation in HUD Section 184. We also want to help Meeks and Senator Brown with pushing the American Dream Down Payment Savings Plan. So those are the two things we're really laser focused on right now.
Great. Well, you all have been concise, and we're right on time. Does anyone have any final points they want to make?
Of course, I have more to say. So I just want to, I talked about equitable housing finance system as one of the solutions. And thank you for mentioning FHA, because it is so critical with these populations that we're talking about. We need, first of all, Bryan Montgomery and his team are doing, really taking a hard look at these issues and understanding and listening, which we really appreciate, because FHA overwhelmingly supports access to credit for Black and Latino families, and they are the disproportionate amount. So I mentioned GSE reform. The GSEs are very small in terms of the service they are giving to Black and Brown communities, and we'd love to see that change and expand and not contract. So I think it's really important as FHFA makes moves and changes in their programming that they consider that as well and their service to these communities. So thank you for bringing up FHA, because I forgot to say it out loud, but I wanted to. The only other thing I wanted to mention was just the just a quick point. I'll just point everybody to two pieces of work that we did. One is a report on barriers to accessing homeownership. This slide that's up here that nobody can read, it may not be up there anymore, but this is the 31 cities that we looked at. It's got the white population, Black, Hispanic, and other is Asian primarily, which it breaks down by MSA. the number of mortgage-ready millennials based on data that we pulled together in this report with Freddie Mac's help, where it looks at income, it looks at DTIs, it looks at credit scores, and essentially gives you the numbers that I was describing earlier about the mortgage-ready millennial populations, and it's broken down by geography. So this is a report you can pull up. Just hit Barriers to Homeownership 2018 in Google, and it'll come up. I think it's an important page that everybody should be aware of in their markets and their communities. The only other point I wanted to make, and I'll wrap there, is on just the importance of homeownership as a wealth builder going forward. We know historically homeownership has provided opportunities for wealth building for generations of families of all kinds. And I just want to kind of close, because I don't know how much time we'll get to spend on it given the time left. Wealth and homeownership matter. A child's likelihood of being a homeowner is greatly determined by their parents' homeownership status. The opportunity to put your child in school or to be able to invest in helping them buy their next home really does come historically from people's homeownership that's been passed down through generations, or the equity that's been passed down through generations. So I just cannot express enough. We've looked a lot of ways at why the homeownership gaps persist. The difference in parental homeownership wealth explains 12 to 13% of the homeownership gap between Black and white young adults. And I think that's significant and really something that we should continue to think about, because we are right now, as we see homeownership rates on the decline for the Black community overall, we are setting up for future generations what looks like an incredibly dire circumstance when it comes to economic mobility and the ability to build wealth through ownership. And so I think it's a really critical piece that I didn't want to leave without mentioning. And one other thing is we just put out a piece that explains, the data around these different rates that you've been hearing thrown around up here on homeownership. Lori Goodman, my partner in crime, put out a piece I thought was really timely and really important that explains these quarterly shifts you're seeing, like the Black homeownership rate in the last quarter just went up 8 percentage points, and how much you need to look at that and weigh that against other things. Most important piece of data we will get is the 2020 census. So I will plug here how critical that census data is to ensuring that we get these numbers right and we understand what is going on all across this nation. We need a strong and credible census. So 2020 census, everybody be all out there and make sure you fill yours out. 2010 census has the best data that we've got on record, and we use the American Community Survey, which is an annual survey that's larger, that gets that 42% that I was mentioning earlier. The quarterly changes we see in the housing vacancy survey are great, but they're great kind of test barometers, but they're very volatile. So just want to point that out and look at Lori's work that she just put out the other day that really helps to explain that, so we don't think that we can take our foot off the gas on Black home ownership because we saw this little increase and we think our work is done. It is not. So, sorry, Jim.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was great. That was great. What I would just sort of leave with this kind of perspective. I know for us who have been around DC and this business a long time, we think about CRA, equal credit opportunity. We talk about Fair Housing Act. We talk about all of these things in the context of legislation and what, unfortunately, the wrongs that had to be fixed legislatively. And so many times we talk about these things as, I got to do this, I have to do this because of whatever, right? Whatever law, whatever regulation. And I do want us to sort of rethink that perspective, and because you kind of, if it's not, you got to do it because someone's telling you to do it. You must do it because it is the market. This is where the growth comes, right? The homeownership rate within the white community may not go up much higher than 73%, right? People may want to just be a renter. But the minority communities, African American, Hispanic, Asian communities, still have plenty of room for growth. That's and we are going to drive first-time buyers of the future. We're going to drive a new homeownership acquisition of the future. And so my only thing is, all of this discussion, I'm glad that you're raising it, but one of the things that I would love is a kind of a perspective change within the industry and say, hey, this is the market. If we want to be in business, we got to embrace it. And that's how I hope this dialogue leads us to.
Well said. Donnell, you wanted one last point?
Well, I wanted to reiterate the how important it is that we focus on those 1.7 million black millennials that are mortgage ready. Our NAREB's own focus group did dictate that if a young person's parents owned a home, they are more likely to purchase again. So you're either going to inherit prosperity or you're going to inherit disadvantage. So we're trying to move that needle so that most of us inherit prosperity.
Wonderful. Well, we're all fair housers now, and I want to thank all of you for your contributions and for your comments here today. This has been a wonderful panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bryan.